Welcome to the Health Catalyst podcast, brought to you by YPO. Here we talk about the business of health innovation, and I sit down with industry leaders who have been in the trenches. My goal is to share the lessons and provide practical and actionable advice to help you launch, grow, and scale your business. Today, my guest is Greg Danes, aka the Churn Doctor. And in today's episode, we'll explore the role of customer churn and provide strategies for enhancing retention in SaaS and subscription-based businesses. I am your host, Rodrigo Hute. Greg, thank you so much for being here today and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Appreciate you having me.
Yeah. Today we're gonna talk about customer retention and churn, one of my favorite topics, especially for all of you here in the audience that run SaaS companies, subscription-based businesses. All of these companies that are focused on recurring revenue. This episode, it's going to be a treat for you because today I am talking with Greg, and Greg has been, working so much time in this space, and he's going to be sharing his wisdom with us today. So, for some reason, most companies are obsessed with revenue growth, but really we should be spending more time thinking about retention, especially if you're in SaaS. If your business is focused on subscriptions. On the one hand, we know that churn is a silent killer and can lead to the leaky bucket problem. And on the other hand, we also know that great retention is the best way to accelerate revenue growth. So we know that already. What most of us didn't know, at least I didn't know, is that the NPS score, the Net Promoter Score, is not a good predictor of retention. So that's where I would like us to begin today, because in my mind, Greg, in my mind, NPS, and I've used NPS, for many different companies. NPS means high satisfaction. It should mean high loyalty, and it should be correlated with retention. But when I came across your work, I read that NPS is not a useful metric for subscription companies. So I wanted to ask you, what's wrong with NPS?
Yeah, well, it's fascinating, right? Because it goes against everything that we think we know about business. Forever, we've just always known that happy customers are the ones who stay and unhappy customers leave. But the belief in this started to shake for me. When I was a founder, CEO in the SaaS world a couple of times, and I had this experience repeatedly that really baffled me, which is that I'd have a customer who would tell me they're leaving, but on the way out, explain to me that they had a great experience and tell me what a positive experience it was. And I would that made no sense to me, right? Because that if they're happy, why are they leaving, right? And then I had another experience, which happened almost as often, which is I'd have some unhappy customer and they would be complaining and they would be frustrated. And yet they kept renewing their contract over and over again, year after year. And I was just baffled, right? This doesn't make sense. It doesn't compute. How could it be true? And so, I started to wonder, and I ran into this book called The Effortless Experience, which was written by Matthew Dixon. It's the same people who wrote the Challenger Sale. And they have really good research in there. And one of the things that they did was to gather all this data about customer loyalty. They were looking at loyalty, and they were asking some interesting questions. And one of the questions that they asked was, what's the relationship between customer satisfaction and how long customers stayed, their loyalty? And they didn't expect this, but what happened was they discovered there was no relationship. They weren't correlated, and that was a shocker. And they had a rather large data set, 100,000 data points. And ever since then, I was like, okay, that matches my experience. It doesn't make sense, but it matches my experience. And so I started to gather the data for my own customers and found the same thing. And then Later, when I built this company, we gathered all this data. We now have the world's largest database of customer retention data. And NPS, in the meantime, became the most popular score that everybody uses to measure customer satisfaction. And so that makes it easy. So we have actually now a much larger study, and we refresh it frequently, at least every year. And it always produces the same result, which is actually there's zero correlation between how happy customers say they are and how long they stay. The average lifespan for customers who give you a 0 or a 1 or a 2, a very low score on the NPS, is the same as customers who give you an 8, 9, or 10. And all of those in between.
Sorry to interrupt you, but that's a shocker to me. When I read your paper, I was in shock because
Right.
I've been using, the NPS score, became, standard for many companies, for many businesses, and people also use it for, for proving product market fit, right? But really, what really drives product market fit is retention, not the NPS survey in itself.
Right. And the assumption, of course, and it seemed reasonable at the time, is that the satisfaction was a good proxy for retention. Like it would predict retention, but it turns out it doesn't. And here's the interesting thing, Rodrigo. We actually have this fantastic data set. So I'm like a kid in a candy store. My background's in economics, so I study all sorts of things. And it turns out lots of things correlate positively with customer retention. All sorts of things, like how big the company is and what they paid and whether you gave them a discount and what their use case is. And honestly, dozens of factors have some correlation. Now, some of them aren't so strong. Some of them are maybe a little spurious. But what's interesting is there's only one factor we've ever tested that never correlates, and it's customer satisfaction. So, and it doesn't matter if it's NPS, we've tested other scores, lots of other scores. Every time we test a satisfaction score, the results come back the same. So that's just, right, very interesting. And of course, there must be some way to explain this experience I had where happy customers were leaving and unhappy customers were staying. And this seems to point us in a new direction. What we know now is that it's not that. So, right, we had to look elsewhere.
Right. Oh, that's very interesting. I remember that you had this chart like showing how, that NPS should be, at the top, and then the ones, it's like leading and giving you very specific results, and it was completely the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, I can put that up if you want. It's fascinating, right? Because
yes, that's the one. Yeah, please show that.
Right?
Yeah,
this is useful, right? Because here we've got the net promoter score, right? 0 to 10. And what you'd expect is something like this. What we have is how long on average did customers who gave that score last, right? You'd think low for a low score, long for a high score. But this is what we actually see.
Yeah. That's the one.
That's the no correlation. Really fascinating, right? And there's a very large data set. These are 133,000 respondents, millions of records. So what the heck's going on? Is there any signal in the NPS data? Well, actually, it turns out there is a signal, but it's not in the score. When we looked at, see what you see on the screen right now, that's just customers who responded to the survey. But only a fraction of customers respond to the survey. Maybe it's 10 or 15% at best. Many companies, it's like 5 to 7%. Well, what did the non-respondents look like? Did they have a similar lifespan? And the answer is no. In fact, the average lifespan for customers who did not respond to the survey is about half, maybe a little less than half. Now, there's something that's interesting. What could that possibly mean? So in other words, a customer who says they hate you, which is like a 0 or a 1 is a score that just says this is the worst vendor we've ever worked with, right? They stay as long as a customer who's giving you an 8 or 9 or 10. But what is contrasted with that is here's all these customers who didn't even bother to respond. Now, this is very interesting because that means this is telling us something. Well, then, this all begs the question, if it's not customer satisfaction or willingness to recommend like NPS does, well, then if it's not that, what is it? Like customers stay for some reason, right? They must be staying for some reason, and something about whether they responded is connected to that. And well, anyway, we've looked at all sorts of things. We've studied We've studied everything. And here's another one we found that was really fascinating. So if you divide customers up into two groups, customers who have had negative experiences with your company and those who have not had negative experiences. So we'll just call those positive, right? If you divide those two into those two groups and you ask how long did they live, you expect something like this, right? You're going to get a much longer lifespan out of customers who haven't had a negative experience. But in fact, the results are just the opposite. Customers who've had a negative experience stay more than twice as long as customers who've never had a negative experience. Now, what in the heck is going on? Right, shocking, right? What's going on? Well, I believe this is actually pointing at the same thing the non-response data is pointing at. Because here's the question. If you were to compare two customers, and you said, customer A, signs up, works really hard to make your solution work, invests a lot of time and energy in it, takes the training, does everything they're supposed to do. And then customer B is one that didn't really try very hard. They signed up, but they didn't really do very much. They never put much work into it. Which of those customers is more likely to have a negative experience? Right? The customer, obviously the customer who tried harder. Why? They're going to run into the problems with your product. They're going to discover where it doesn't meet their expectations. They're going to discover all of the problems. But the customer who didn't try very hard, well, they're not going to have any problems. They didn't do enough to get into any problems. So the reality is, here's the thing to take away from this. It's not that negative experiences cause you to stay longer. That's not what the lesson is here. The lesson is that customers who try harder are more likely to have negative experiences and are more likely to get good results, right? So actually, this is not telling you what causes customer retention. This is an artifact of the thing that causes retention. And what is that? Customer results. So we've looked at all these different factors, right? We've tested everything, but they're by far and away the most predictive factor we've ever tested in customer retention is customers who get measurable results. And in fact, it's 6 times. Customers who get any level of measurable results stay 6 times longer than customers who don't measure their results. So it's a huge difference. And by the way, if they get good,
even if they have bad results.
Oh, let's talk about that. So I'm going to show you this chart. So this is a chart. I'll have to explain it a little bit. This is what we call a cohort survival chart. What these are is this is groups of customers, and essentially what you see is at the left, it's the beginning of their lifespan, right, when they signed up, and then going across the bottom is how long, right? So what you see in each group is the amount or the share of those customers that are still customers after each period of time. So higher curves are better, lower curves have more churn. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So what we have here is based on the amount of results. So the red curve is customers who did not measure their results. We actually don't know if they got good results. They might actually have good results, but we don't know because they didn't measure, which means they also don't know. Okay. So the average, well, the half-life of that, or the average lifespan, one way to think of it is the half-life, that's 14 months for that group. So very high churn. You barely keep half your customers in 1 year. Well, if we show customers results, meaning we measure them, and they're bad, like these are results that are just terrible. They're not acceptable, right? Maybe they're 0. We're measuring it and we're showing they didn't get results. Mostly that's what we found. Notice that curve is significantly higher. And in fact, the average lifespan in that group is slightly more than double the lifespan of customers who aren't measuring. Some of whom, as I said, might actually be getting results. So we've already doubled the lifespan just by showing customers they're getting no results. Think about that. Now, I work with companies that are trying to bring their churn down, as everybody is. And I can tell you right now that my clients, if they could simply double the average lifespan of their customers, they'd almost all be out of the woods. They would almost all have no real major churn problems. So it doesn't even matter. Think about that. You don't even have to achieve good or excellent results to solve most churn problems. You just simply have to start measuring them. Now, you notice if you get good results or expected results, as we call it, this is like typical for your product. The lifespan goes up significantly. That's where we get close to 6x. And then if they get great results, superior results, it's 10 times longer lifespan. So it's a really powerful effect. This is the real, like, this data demonstrates that the fundamental reason customers stay isn't because they're happy, it's because they're getting results, measured results. And so that's the strategy. That's what works.
Yeah. Let's before we talk about like some strategies to improve and maximize retention. Let's talk about churn a little bit more. You've mentioned a couple of times that you think of retention in three ways. So there are like three types of retention, three types of churn. Can you elaborate a little bit on that, please?
Yeah. So when you think about that curve that we just saw, you notice it has a particular shape, and I can put up a little a demonstration of this too. But you notice that it wasn't a straight line. So one of the things that we find when we do this research is that the way we talk about churn typically isn't very helpful, because we just say churn, right? And we say we have a 20% churn rate or something like that. Well, that doesn't tell us anything, because what it implies is false, which is that churn is a constant rate. But obviously that's not true. When you actually measure churn, you get some kind of a shape like that, right? Now, this is a group of customers, right? They all started together, and over time, you'll notice that we lose more customers early in this shape and then less and less over time. That makes sense, right? If you think about it, most companies would probably be true, and that's what we find when we research it. So in this case, they lose more customers early. We call that early churn. Typical early churn, at least for a SaaS or a subscription product, is like first year. Okay, so think of it as churn that happens in the first year. They don't even make it to their first annual renewal. That's a good example of early churn. Now, mid churn, you can see it's kind of that middle section. It slows down a little bit, but it's still happening. Think of that as roughly the second year. And then late churn is kind of anything after the second year. Usually, by the time you're at the end of the second year, you've made 2 renewals, so they're now in their third year. Typically, those are successful customers, and we will lose very few of those. So this is kind of the classic shape. That's why we talk about early, mid, and late churn, okay? So these 3 phases of churn are important because they behave differently, but here's the more important reason. The more important reason is that there are different causes. So if you think about customers who leave really early are leaving for different reasons than a customer who leaves you, after 4 years, for instance. So why do customers leave early? Our research shows it's mostly because either they were a bad fit in the first place, or we couldn't get them to their first measurable results. Well, okay, let's flip it. What if they leave late? What are the reasons, the primary drivers of late churn? Well, they're different. By then, clearly they're not a bad fit, and clearly they didn't fail in onboarding, so it must be something else. And right, so it turns out there's a couple of things there. In some cases, these customers no longer need the product. That's one example. But the more common example is they're actually successful with your product, but they need more features. They need to expand to a better system. They need to add more, and they grow out of your system. So that's another example. So that's why it's actually quite helpful to think in terms of the 3 kinds of churn, because it allows us to narrow our understanding, our focus of what's driving our churn. If you have a lot of early churn, then clearly you should focus mostly on that. And that means fixing your marketing and sales problems that bring in the wrong customers, and fixing your onboarding to make sure it gets customers to early measurable results. So that's a strategy for a company that has dominantly early churn. And by the way, probably 85% of SaaS companies that we've tested, we've done hundreds of these analyses, have this sort of pattern that you see. And in fact, the shape that's on here, I'll go back. This is actually our benchmark curve. So we put all the SaaS B2B companies in a benchmark, and we say, what does overall churn look like in the industry? And that's what it is. And so typically this is what, when we do an analysis, we'll compare the churn of the company to this benchmark to see how they compare.
Yeah. So just I wanted to clarify that the examples that you just mentioned are B2B, for this, for the audience, this is B2B, this is not B2C, direct to consumer. it's different, and it goes, the churn it's way faster in the first year. But here we're talking about B2B. Um, I I know that you don't believe in kind of the non-cohort retention or the blended retention, if you will. I think I agree with you that the best way to look at churn is to look at cohort cohort retention and look at those curves by period. But however, you know, investors, board members, they love to see the blended churn rate. They want to see one single number because it's easy to understand, it's easy to compare with other portfolio companies that they have invested in. And also, a lot of companies use one uh, number also to calculate lifetime value and so on. So what do you think about that? What do you think about the difference between cohort retention versus non-cohort or
Yeah.
blended?
Well, I totally understand that, and it is a big deal because if you walk in and try to not give them your churn or retention rate, they'll just say go get it, right? So you don't really have a choice in the board meeting. But here's the thing: the problem with those is pretty severe, right? That distortion effect you get, where essentially a churn rate doesn't just measure churn. Churn's in the numerator, but there's also a denominator, and that's total. So it's churned accounts over total accounts, or churned dollars over total dollars, or retained, which is just the reverse. The reason that's a problem, right, is that it is the denominator can change. So we could have a big upswing in sales, which will make it look like churn went down when in fact it didn't. Or we could have a big drop in sales, which makes it look like churn went up. And this has actually been happening over the last year because actually a lot of companies have had huge drops in sales over 2023 in particular. And so I had all these CEOs calling me saying, Greg, panic, we've had a huge increase in churn. Well, maybe or maybe not. And we would do their analysis. And the vast majority of the time, actually, there had been no real increase in churn. So I strongly recommend to boards that they start using a different number. I agree one number is helpful. The number that we recommend is called half-life. So essentially, it's how long does it take to lose half your customers? This is an alternative both to the churn rate without the churn rate distortion problem, but it's also a useful measure of the lifespan. Because here's the thing, an average lifespan, it doesn't tell you what constitutes that. It could be as low as 1 and as high as 10 years, and there's still an average that's at 5 years, right? So I don't really know much. The half-life's a much more useful way to think about average lifespan. So I've been educating board members for this for the last few years, and it's starting to catch on. There's a lot more people who want to see the half-life in addition to their standard churn metrics.
So you have to define what the half-life means
Yeah,
in
I have
order
to teach
to
them.
show it.
Yeah, I have to teach them.
Yeah.
But if you have the
Yeah.
curve, right, you can show them, look, here's where we lost half our customers, 50%, and it's like, well, for the benchmark, it's 27 months. So the composite half-life of the whole SaaS B2B world is 27 months. That's
Right.
a useful way to think about it. And by the way, it's partly useful because of that, but it's also because it's not a straight line. So each company will have a slightly different slope or shape, and they'll have a different degree. So it ends up being just impossible to compare companies. So this is one of the mistakes that board members make or investors make when they use a churn or retention rate, is that they think they can compare them to their other companies, and you really can't. But you can with half-life, actually.
All right. Yeah. I have questions about benchmarks. I'll get to that
Okay.
in a minute. Before we get to that, going back to cohort analysis, cohort analysis, the question that I have for you is like, how much dissecting it's enough? How much is enough? So you can do cohorts by period, like by month, by customer type, by product, by geography, by acquisition channel. There are many different ways to dissect your customer base. So if you're doing cohort analysis, what are the kind of best practices or things that you would recommend to do really good cohort analysis?
Yeah, it's a great question. So all by itself, it reveals, right? Here, I'll put one up. All by itself, it's revealing something which is quite important. It's just what kind of churn do we have? Do we have the early or the late churn? So that's one thing. Then you can do something which is very important, which is, can I see how it's going, right? Is it getting better or worse? And to do that, you would do annual or quarterly cohorts or even monthly cohorts. So we can actually see, is it getting worse? In this case, it's getting worse. The curves are going down, right? Which means the half-life is going down. So that's something you cannot do with rates, with churn or retention rates. But you can do the same thing with other factors. So you just named a few, like maybe we could compare, instead of by year, we could compare by segment or by product or by size of company or almost anything you can think of. So your question is, well, how much of that is helpful? Like, do we have to have a lot of that? Well, my argument is that you get a lot of value even if you don't have any of that, because of the questions that this type of analysis answers that I just talked about. But you can get a lot of value if you can go further. So, for instance, company size is a good example. Small, mid, and enterprise companies all have different levels of churn across the industry. Enterprise companies pretty much always have higher retention than small companies, and mid-market
Yeah.
tends to be between. Well, why does that matter? Well, when we do an analysis and we break it out and we discover the small companies churn more than large companies, is that really interesting? Well, it is interesting if, for instance, you are dominantly focused on small companies and they're all leaving you, right? So then you got a real problem. But like sometimes we'll look at a company and we'll discover, yeah, their small companies churn more, but they do much better than other companies' small customers. So that's really interesting, because what that means is that company has a competitive advantage in selling to small companies. They can actually do better than their competitors or better than other companies. So it does reveal a lot. And you can go to very deep. We do analyses where we'll study several dozen additional factors, down to which rep sold the deal and what country they're from and which product features they used and how soon they started adopting, and you name it, all sorts of factors. Why would we do that? Who cares? What difference does it make to have so many? Well, the answer is because that tells you something which I argue is a really important thing to know. And that is that the mistake that is often made in customer success is to treat all churn the same, right? Customers are churning, we got to solve it. But the problem is you can't solve it in the same way. It depends on what drove the churn. So if you can narrow down the kind of churn that you have dominantly, then you can build playbooks and strategies to address that churn and stop treating it all the same. And this is important too, especially over the last years. Companies have felt like they weren't sure their investments in customer success were worth it, right? They couldn't see the benefit. And so there's been a lot of turmoil in the industry as a result. Well, this is a way to really address that, because I have very few resources. I really can't, succeed by smearing a thin layer of customer success across all my accounts. The only strategy that will work is if I figure out what are the dominant drivers of churn, which groups are churning and exactly when, and then put all my resources on that. That's how you move the needle. That's what we do with our clients. And it really can radically change your results, right? Your retention. You can move the needle much more quickly that way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes total sense. Uh, that's a good segue to the next question, and you were alluding to this earlier about the kind of benchmarks, and you cannot really compare, but everyone, especially investors and board members, they tend to ask about, hey, so I want to compare your retention to other companies' retention. So how do you know if you have good retention or not? Like what's good retention, and what's your opinion on using benchmarks, for
Yeah.
retention and churn?
So great question. So I've already said you can't do it with churn or retention rates. In fact, a company can't even compare its own retention rate to one 6 months ago. That's how much distortion there is, particularly in high growth or highly volatile growth situations, which have been the norm in tech for years. So then can you do that with half-lives? It turns out, and we have a bunch of research on this, but it turns out you can. And here's why. Once you've removed that distortion that rates have, and the cohort analysis does that, it's what we call raw churn, right? And once you've removed that, what we started to notice, and then we were able to research this at scale, is that there seems to be a strong relationship between the half-life, which is a way of saying how much churn do you have, right? Remember, the average for the whole industry is 27 months. That's like the average half-life. So how much churn you have measured by half-life is comparable across companies. And here's why. Because there's a relationship between your half-life and your ability to grow. Now, remember, the only reason we care about churn at all is because it holds back growth. And we can't, grow very fast if we have to constantly replace all the customers we sold last year. And it's even worse because we also then can't expand those customers. So churn's really bad. Like you started this whole conversation. Absolutely right. Okay, I'm comparing the half-life across companies. And what we noticed was that companies with a half-life less than 36 months, that means they lose half their customers in the first 3 years, had a really hard time growth. Their growth was very, very slow. And many of them were in negative growth. Whereas companies that had a half-life greater than 36 months tended to grow fairly effortlessly or even quite rapidly. Now, if you had a half-life of 48 months, it's even better, or 60 months, even better, right? So what we found was that there is a pretty consistent relationship between churn measured by half-life and growth. So this turns out to be a useful benchmark. So when we talk to our clients, we show them the benchmark and we say, essentially, if you're below 36 months, you have too much churn. You're going to need to bring that churn down, or you're going to have a hard time growing, even if you can sell rapidly. Because remember, that's the other factor. There's two factors: how much you sell and then how much you lose, right? Well, if you have too much churn, it doesn't matter how fast you sell, you can never keep up with it. So the answer is, companies that have 36-month or lower or higher half-life, that's low churn, tend to be able to grow pretty fast. And the lower the churn, the better, obviously. So 48-month half-life is like top 2% of the companies that we study. Those are the good growers. Like if I want to invest in a company that can grow, that's the one I want to invest in. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. So what do you think when they say, oh, for enterprise SaaS, 70% retention is good, 90% retention is great? What do you think when someone says that?
The problem is I don't know what 70% means, because it depends on what kind of churn that is. And also that's certainly distorted by their current sales rate. So, I can't use it.
What if they say it's a retention rate at 6 months? So
Yeah,
they
okay.
would that be equivalent to the midlife or the half-life
Sort of,
that you were
right?
saying?
That's like a fraction of that. Yeah. So our 6-month retention rate is 70%, is
Yeah,
not very good. That's pretty bad, right? Because to have a 36-month half-life, you have to lose only 50% over the first 3 years. So I can't lose more than about 25% in the first year,
in
or
the
I'm
first
not
year.
going to make it. 90% half retention at 6 months would be pretty good.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so now we've talked about churn. Now let's talk about how to fix how to fix the problem and how to improve retention. So I mean, we all of us that we've worked in subscription businesses, we know that fixing retention takes time. Retention, it's a lagging indicator. You need, and also you need at least, if you're a startup, you need at least 12 to 18 months, of data to be able to analyze and run some cohort analysis. But because it takes time, I think that we have to focus on leading indicators.
Mm.
Something that you can measure on a weekly, monthly basis, something like that. So what are your favorite examples, or the things that you would normally measure as leading indicators of, to see if you're actually improving your retention or not?
Right. Well, we've already disqualified one. I'm not going to use customer satisfaction or NPS. So
We are
that
not
one's
going to
out.
do NPS.
Okay. So, and I've already told you another one, which is measurable customer results, is clearly a leading indicator. Now, any level turns out to be a pretty good predictor. So a customer that's getting poor results is still much more likely to stay 6 months or 2 years from now than a customer who's not measuring at all or not getting anything. So that's one. But truly, that's actually not the most leading indicator, right? Because results are why customers stay. The question is, why do they get results? Why do some customers get results and others don't? That's where we really find the good leading indicators. So the best leading indicators are essentially any customer behaviors that are likely to produce good results. So one of them we know is utilization, adoption, but that one turns out to be not as good as we thought. And here's why. Um, the vast majority of customers early on are going to try it a little bit. Now, some customers are going to adopt it very strongly, and others are just going to be tepid. They're not going to try very hard. But if you're just looking at an early adoption metric, it's a pretty good indicator. I still want to watch that one, so definitely, but it's not the only one I want to watch. The problem with utilization comes at the other end. So if we're watching customers who are using the software, and we see one of them drop utilization, like maybe it takes an 80% drop, and we say, oh, that's a risk indicator. Well, yeah, it's a risk indicator, but it's not a leading risk indicator. It's a lagging risk indicator. What it means is they've already stopped. They've already failed. So what we found in our data, and very consistently in practice as well, is that by the time a customer slows down or stops using your product, it's already too late. The rescue rates, the success rates at rescuing customers in that situation are very low. And the other thing that's really interesting, Rodrigo, is even when they do rescue those customers, we follow them for another couple years and we discover that most of them still churn soon after that. So what we find is that we can't use utilization or adoption as a good predictor of retention. Early on, it's pretty good, so I definitely want to track it, but it's pretty much a lagging indicator after that. So then what else is there? Well, it turns out there's a set of things that are really good indicators. The problem is that you have to create them. So here's my example. The question of why customers stay is answered. We know they stay because they get results. But that just begs the next question. Why do some customers get results? And the answer is because they change their behavior to take advantage of the way your product produces results. So if you see a customer who comes in and they take your advice and they try very hard to operate that way, we have a very good prediction that they're going to stay. They're going to succeed. But if a customer comes in, doesn't listen to your advice, doesn't want to change the way they work, they're going to fail at a very, very high rate. So what I'm saying is that the best leading indicator of customer success and retention is customer behavior. Now, why did I say you have to create it? Because those kind of behavior trackers don't come out of your product. You know, we can watch how they're using the product in some cases. And like I said, that adoption is pretty good. It's definitely one I want to keep. But the best ones are things like, did they, adopt this as their new standard approach? Did they decommission the old system? Did they roll it out? And do they have, buy-in? Did they train their users? Lots of behaviors around the system turn out to be useful. Well, we can't track dozens of those. The good news, you don't need to. You need to just pick one or two, or at most three, very important early behaviors and find a way to track those. And when customers do them, they are very low risk for churn. And when they don't do them after some period of time, they're at a very high risk. Okay. And then the time is the other issue. How long do we wait for them to do these behaviors? And we've done a bunch of research on this where we've had the data, and it's actually really interesting. So I had a client, a very large company, very large data set, and they were curious, how soon could we tell a customer was going to fail? There was an annual contract. So in the churn data, you can't tell they're failing till 12 months. But what we had was this behavior data. And what we found was that customers, they were shocked. They thought they had about 90 days to get customers going in order to get them successful, right? If after that, they're probably at risk. It turned out it was less than 10 days. Customers who had not adopted the key behaviors in the first 10 days churned at a 90% rate. So it was absolutely incredible. Even I was shocked. And it shows you that, and this will vary by company. Obviously, it's different per company, but it shows you that we usually don't have as much time as we think we have. So we need to be very careful. We need to track those leading behaviors. What are the critical things good customers do? And then let's track those. Then later, those should turn into results. We should track those. And that the composite of those two things is really very good.
I like that. I really like that part when you said like leading behaviors instead of leading indicators. That's very helpful. So on, so really spending a lot of time on in the onboarding process. Onboarding is absolutely key, and ongoing education and support focused around those leading behaviors. Is
Yes.
that correct?
Onboarding's way more important than we realized. I always thought it was important, but the more we've studied it, the more important we realize it is, right? And here's another problem with the churn rate. It makes it look like customers are all dying at the same age, but they're not. Most of your customers fail in infancy. So this is actually a comparison to human mortality rates. This is very interesting. So what we found, in the, I don't know, 1700s, humans had a much lower lifespan, right? Our average lifespan was much shorter. Maybe it was 55 or 60. I don't remember. But what that does is that creates the false impression that everyone couldn't live past 60 years old. But that's actually not what was happening. There were lots of 80, 90, and even 100-year-olds 300 years ago. What was happening was that a lot of people were dying in as infants, right? Right at birth or shortly after. So that reduces the average lifespan, but it doesn't actually tell you anything about how long people typically lived, right? If you made it past the first year of life back then, you were as likely to make it to 80 as people are today. So that's really interesting. So when we look at customer lifespan, we find the same thing. What we find is that, yeah, your average lifespan might be, let's say it's 4 years, okay? Your lifetime average lifespan for customers, and then you calculate your lifetime value from that. But what you find out when we do cohort survival analysis is that actually the vast majority of customers are dying in infancy. They're failing very, very quickly. That's why everything that you do at the front end of the relationship is important. And that isn't just onboarding, that's also how you sold them. It turns out that the way we sell customers sets them up either for success or failure very, very early on. So it's actually a lot like the infant mortality problem, right? And in fact, by the way, the cohort survival curves is a technique that was developed to study human lifespan and infant mortality. So
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
not a surprise that we can use that technique very effectively for customer lifespan.
So I agree with you that early churn, which is kind of the biggest drop
Mhm.
most of the time, uh, makes sense that it's because of sales and marketing. Maybe there is an unclear you know targeting, focusing on the ideal customer profile. That part I get. I also get that sales could be overselling, and probably they need to set expectations during the sales process to make sure that they are not over promising what we can do with the product. So I get that part. I think sales and marketing, if you fine tune your sales and marketing approach, you could be fixing part of the early retention. Like I agree with that. And I also agree that onboarding, it's absolutely key to do it very, very well to all of your new customers at the early stages.
Mm.
Um, what about product? I also worked at companies where customers churn. When there is a problem with churn, we all you know uh, talk about the product. Oh, maybe maybe we don't have good product market fit. Maybe the people are not getting the value out of the product. And sometimes it's true, and sometimes it's not. So, what's your opinion, and what have you found in terms of uh, oh, there's a problem with churn. We have to go and fix the product. We have to make it better.
This is a tough one because there are two ways to think about this. In truth, the product produces everything. It produces whether there's benefits or not, whether they're measurable or not, for what kinds of customers it can work. So we can't deny the fact that we all live in the box that products creates. We're all constrained by what it can do, for whom, how quickly, how well. Um, but there's a problem with that from another perspective, and that is, okay, we're living inside that box. It is what it is, right? So then, if customers are failing at a high rate for our product, one way to think of it is, should they be customers at all? Right? So one of the limitations products have is who it will work for. And if you want it to work for more people, you can't just tell customer success to go make it work for more people. That's delusional. It either works for a certain kind of customer or it doesn't. And so it turns out, and I want to go back to marketing and sales, it's a huge issue to accept that the product is what it is. Okay. I want to touch on that and not sell customers for whom it will not work. The number one single biggest driver in SaaS is bad fit customers. On its own, that's the single biggest driver of churn that we see. So one thing you can't do is just complain that the product isn't good enough for all the customers you'd like to sell it to. It may be true, by the way, but it's irrelevant because how fast can you fix the product? When you say it's got to be fixed, what's the typical time in SaaS that it takes to fix it? And the answer is not months, years, right? It could be a year before you can actually meaningfully address an issue that's severely constraining who you can sell the product to. So in the meantime, the only solution is to stop selling it to customers who can't win. Okay, that's one thing about the product. Let's just own the reality. And if you're on the customer success side and you're saying, all my customers are failing because the product sucks. Well, I want to talk about something. You said maybe it's true, maybe it's not. No, it's always true. It's always true. You've never worked for a company, and you never will, that has a perfect product. There's no such thing. Microsoft, nobody has perfect products, and the problems aren't trivial. I don't believe they're trivial. I think if you look at another company and you imagine their product is good enough or perfect enough, that just means you haven't used it deeply or you're not exposed to it. All products are profoundly flawed. The issue is, but if they're so broken, why do some customers get really good results? And virtually any company you go look at has really successful customers. So the first problem is to stop being delusional about who the product is for. That's number one. That's product market fit. Okay. Let's not kid ourselves that you can sell this product to someone it's not going to work for. So stop doing that. Then the second thing is when we get good customers in who are a good fit, there's still lots of things that can go wrong. That's where onboarding comes into play. And we have to change the way we think about onboarding. Onboarding isn't where we install and configure and train you to use the product. That's not what onboarding is. Onboarding is where we figure out how to get you to your first measurable results. Installing and configuring and training are trivial. Those are derivative issues. The fundamental issue, and actually the real reason good fit customers don't get to results, is usually because we don't stop to clearly identify those issues and then to tell the customer what they'll have to do to achieve it. We have this whole ethos in customer success that's all reactive. We'll be very responsive, we'll be very helpful. Well, that's an artifact of thinking that customers stay because they're happy. And that's how I make you happy, is I'm very solicitous, I'm very responsive, but it actually doesn't work. What I have to be is prescriptive. What I have to do is tell you, customer, this is what you want, and this is what you have to do to get it. Because if we're not aggressive and we're not prescriptive, customers don't know what to do. The vast majority of our customers don't actually know how to do the business that they do very well. Some of our customers do. Somewhere between 6 and 13% of our customers are really good at what they do. And we learn from them and we watch them, and it's very impressive. But the rest of them actually are not very good at what they do. And that's part of the reason, by the way, they're our customers. They're trying to improve what they're doing. But you can't assume that they know how to do it well. And so actually the companies that are doing really well, that are solving the churn problem, are the ones who've become very aggressive at the front end to teach their customers how to achieve success. And that's not just use our system. That's how to run their business in the right way. And it's a really different way of thinking. A lot of companies really struggle with this because they think, well, we make a tool, right? No, the product, here's the way I say it, Rodrigo. Technology doesn't produce results. Customer behavior change produces results, and technology makes it possible and scalable. What I mean by that, here's the mental exercise. If you turn your product on for a customer, we'll assume it's like a SaaS product or something like that. If they buy it and you turn it on, but no one makes any difference, no change in the way they behave, will they get results? The answer is, of course they won't. They have to change how they're working to adopt the new technology. So is it really the technology that produced the results? Is it really the product? Or is it actually the customer's behavior change? I have a great story about this. So I joined this company to run customer success, and they had what appeared to be phenomenal results. Just everybody was getting these great measurable results. And so the first thing I wanted to do was go fly around to all the big customers and hear about it, learn about it. What did they do to get results? And I went to this company, it's a very famous company back east. And I went to their office, and the guy said, "Oh, this has been the best thing for us. Our results have gone up 30%. And I said, "Fantastic, right? Show me how you implemented it." And he said, "Oh, we didn't implement it." What? Well, we never turned it on. We had some problems with our integration and our servers and stuff, so we have never turned it on. I said, "I don't understand. You just told me you got 30% improvement." He said, "Oh, we did, because when we started with you, one of your geniuses came out and trained us how to do our jobs better. And that led to us improving our productivity by 30%. We just hope that when the system's turned on, it'll get even better." Now think about that story. Isn't that incredible? This was a customer who had stood on stage for us and bragged about how great we were. It's incredible. We just have to understand that the product doesn't produce results. The customer produces results by doing things in a new way. And the product hopefully is good enough to support them in doing those new things in that new way. And if that's true, Rodrigo, I'll just end with this. If that's true, then our job isn't to implement a product. It's not even to sell a product. I mean, we have to. We better have a product, and it better be pretty good. But the reality is, fundamentally, what drives customers to the results that cause them to stay forever is the change they make in how they do business, how they work. And you don't get that by just throwing them technology. You do that by taking responsibility to teach them how to do their job better. And when you pair that with technology, that's the magic formula.
So customer success, they have to become business coaches.
They really do, right? And that means that what you do in customer success depends on what business you're in, right? Because the advice isn't generic. It's specific to the domain you're operating in. So I'm working with a client right now that works with professional services firms, consultants and law firms and things like that. The advice they're giving their customers is very specific to how to be a successful professional services company. And then secondarily, how you can use our software to help you do that. You see, that's different. That's flipped backwards. The standard way we think about it is we give you technology and then you'll figure out how to do it well, and maybe we'll throw out a suggestion every now and then. No, that's backwards.
Yeah, no, this is very good. Very, very interesting. So as sales and marketing, they have to get their act together, make sure that they have their ICP, their ideal customer profile, very well defined, and bringing the right customer. Then customer success, they have to do a really good job at onboarding, not just training them about the new product and installing and stuff like that, but becoming real partners and business coaches to make sure that they drive a behavior change within their companies.
Right.
Sure, you have to keep improving your product. Maybe sometimes your products are not good, so you need to keep working. You have to make it stickier. You have to, make sure that the product delivers real results, because otherwise, there is no way that you're gonna keep your customers for a long time.
Right.
What else are we missing? I would also wanted to ask you about the role of pricing and discounts. Sometimes a lot of companies will say, okay, maybe we can play with the price. Maybe we need to have a different pricing strategy. Maybe we can use discounts for some customers that cannot afford our product anymore. So any insights on that?
Yeah, in fact, we have a lot of research that's turned up some very interesting results on this. So you do have to constantly assess your pricing, right? There's no way around it. It's a very competitive world, and you're not doing well if you're not, constantly aware that you should be thinking about how your pricing is competitive. But here's the thing. there's lots of things we do in pricing that we don't realize have an impact on churn. So here's an example, the one you mentioned, discounts. It turns out that regardless of what your price level is, if you offer a customer a steep discount, that's more than 25%, so like 50% off if you sign today, that customer is more likely to churn than if they had not received a steep discount. And why is that? People wonder. Well, the answer is fairly clear to people who work on the customer side. It's that it creates the false impression on the customer's mind that this isn't very valuable, and they don't try very hard. And when they don't try very hard, they don't get good results and they churn. So it's a psychological impact. So whatever pricing you choose, don't give people 50 or 75% discounts thinking that you're creating, a positive alignment, because that's actually not true. But what about price just in general? Should you just have one price for all customers? Well, no, and here's why. So one of the popular methods, at least in SaaS, has been a all-in-one pricing, right? One price, you get everything in the product. You don't have to buy more modules, etc. Well, it sounds really good, except that there's another psychological factor going on. So what happens is the vast majority of your customers will use only a tiny fraction of the functionality they purchased, right? So they'll use 5 or 10% of the features. Some customers will use more, but let's say that the average is 10 or 20% of your product. Well, you get a year or two down the road and that customer says, you know what? Why am I paying all this money when I'm using only a few of the features? And they start to get annoyed. And then you have this problem where now I have to offer them discounts to keep them. And that actually doesn't work. We have data that shows that doesn't work. So all-in-one pricing turns out to not be a great strategy. A better strategy, break your product up into components, modules, or levels, sell customers just what they need now, and then upgrade them. It turns out that not only does that keep them longer, but the upgrading or expansion side drives much higher retention as well. So that's kind of the best scenario. And a lot of products are not designed to be modularized like that, to be sold in pieces. That's bad. That's actually really bad for long-term retention. So there's another example.
Yeah, that's really good. Also, going back to the cohort analysis, the ideal scenario is to have the happy face chart, right? Like if you were thinking about revenue retention, then yes, after some time, when you get to the expansion phase, and you keep upgrading and adding new products or services, then that's when you can expand more.
Exactly right.
The other question that I have, it's around commissions and incentives to customer success teams. Have you found anything in your research that suggests that like giving better or more commissions or bringing better customer success teams will drive that? And I think it would, because you just mentioned that if you are able to change behavior with your customers, and the only way to do that is through people, not the product, but the people that are actually coaching you to do a better job in your company, then that should drive more retention and more results. So the question is, what have you found around commissions and incentivizing teams?
So yeah, really good question. So incentives matter everywhere we look at them, because they either incentivize the right behavior or they incentivize the wrong behavior. And so they can be very bad for your customer success team if you don't get them right. Now, the classic approach is to essentially pay the variable component, the incentive component in a CSM salary based on retention, mostly, right? Maybe a little bit for expansion. This is not great, and I'll tell you why it's not great. Because retention's the outcome. If I'm paying you only for the outcome, then what's your incentive to invest all of that time advising your customers on how to get better results? Instead, what we see is that CSMs will sort of sub-optimize, and they will focus their time on certain customers they think they can get to win, and they'll let other customers go because they're harder work. And so that's not what I want for my CSMs. So what I actually recommend, we still have to pay people based partly on retention, but I would like the dominant variable component, the way I recommend it, is that should be based on customer results. So if we're measuring customer results, which is what I strongly recommend every company start to do, then what I want to see is, are you driving measurable results in your customers? I want to pay you if you're measuring at all. That's a win. Even if the results are bad, then are they good, or are they better, or are they expanding? Those are the 4 factors that I really want to drive as the primary factors in your variable incentive plan. And I don't like making the outcome, like gross retention or net retention, be the dominant driver. In fact, net retention is the worst. That's the one I think companies should stay away from. And ironically, it's by far the most popular.
So can you give us an example on that? Can you just, it would be interesting for the audience to think about how would that incentive plan would look like in practice. Give me just an example.
So an example would be, I do not like CS incentive plans to have more than 20% variable. I think they're not like sales. It's a little different. I want people to be settled, and I want them to follow our playbooks, and I want them to be consistent. So if we put too much variable in there, it can drive erratic behavior. So let's say 20% is variable, for example. Of the 20%, half of it I would be based on the share of their customers that are getting good results, acceptable results, and we would define the range of results, right? And then the other half, I would want it to be on some combination of retention and what we call MBO. So this is like behaviors that we're working on doing. So here's the thing. What we found is that the highest performing customer success teams are the ones that have everything standardized. Now, this sounds wrong. When you talk to people, they say, oh no, what's important is that every customer be treated differently. They're all unique. Nope, that's wrong. That's wrong. If you want to drive high results at scale, you have to standardize everything. There's one way to onboard. There's one standard way to check in with your customers. There's one set of expectations around the playbook that I'm asking you to spend your time on. And so the last 25% of the variable component, so 50% was results, 25% would be something like a retention or I prefer gross retention to net retention. And then the last 25% of the variable would be MBOs, which would basically be, how well are you following and implementing the playbooks? What's your compliance on the playbooks, right? How many of your customer meetings are you hitting? How many of them have defined results plans, or what we call customer results strategy? How many of them, right, are getting their first results out of onboarding, et cetera? So like the set of behaviors that we want to do, and what I talk about are 4 playbooks. What we found is there's only 4 playbooks in customer success that have any proof that they work at all. And so what I want to know is, how well are my people operating the playbooks? How close are they sticking to the required plan? And I want to pay at least a quarter of their variable on that.
All right. Sounds good. Sounds like a good practice to implement. Greg, my final question. I have one more question, and then we're gonna be done for today, for this episode. And it's about, what are the systems, processes, and capabilities that you must have in place in order to do a good job with retention and churn. Of course, you need data. Think about, you have startups, you have medium-sized companies, you have large companies with different kinds of capabilities and systems. And you need a data warehouse, you need analytics, you need prediction models, you need people and training and so on. So what are the things that you would say this is the bare minimum? Like, if you think about level 1, level 2, level 3 based on sophistication, what would you say it's the bare minimum, and then what would you add on top of that?
Yeah, great question. I think most companies way over engineer what they think they need. I actually think it's much simpler than most companies realize. But there's one part of it that's not simple, and we have to acknowledge that. The fundamental central backbone of operating this way is, can you measure all your customers' results all the time? Very few companies have built the infrastructure to do that. right? Sometimes those results come out of the software itself. Sometimes they're built on a combination of data the customer has and you have. All right. So you might be dependent on customer. It doesn't matter. However hard it is, that's the most important capability that you need. And it does require some data infrastructure. But people ask me all the time, how much data do we need to track about our customers? Not as much as you think. Some basic things. There's about 20 data points that we recommend, and you may not need all of them. But you do need to know, where they are in their contract. You need to know how they're doing in terms of adoption. But the most important thing you need to know is what are their results and how are they doing on the key behaviors that you identified as leading indicators. So there might be just, a dozen or two key things that you need to track, but some of those are essential. You have to track them. So that's one part. The other thing is, I need a way to do this well. I just talked about how the playbooks have to be standardized and they have to have high adherence. We have to have everybody doing them exactly right? Why? Well, because that's the only way I know if they're working. So when I design a playbook, it's possible I designed it wrong. Okay, fair enough. I won't know what's wrong unless we're tracking every aspect of it. When we do that, then I can see where it's failing and I can optimize it. I cannot optimize any process steps that I'm not tracking. So we have to keep our process simple enough that we can track it in data. And then I'm going to use that data heavily to both enforce compliance, get everybody operating that way, but also so that I can see where it's not effective and we can optimize it. So, base level is, can we just track which customers have measured results? Then second, what are the results? That would be level 2, right? And then level 3 would be, what are the behaviors that drive results and what are the results? That's the top level.
All right. Amazing. Really, really good. Greg, I want to thank you. Thank you for your time and for sharing your invaluable insights today with all of us. Where can people find more about you and your work?
Yeah, well, I do a lot on LinkedIn, so connect with me on LinkedIn at Greg Danes. And then also my website, which is gregdanes.com. I publish all of my research there. There's some ebooks that talk about several of the things I've mentioned, all that stuff about discounts and NPS. You can find all that stuff there. All our research is published there. And then my company is ChurnRx. This is where we help companies, analyze their churn and design their new playbooks, et cetera. So those are the three best places.
Sounds good. Thank you, Greg. Thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure.
And thanks everyone for watching. So until the next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.